All right. I think we are ready to go here. This is the last review that we are scheduled to have for the Unit 2/midterm exam that is due in a couple days on Sunday. So yeah, this is an opportunity for you to ask any questions that you have about the material for whatever exam you have coming up. For my hybrid classes, it's the Unit 2 exam. For my Wednesday class, it is the midterm exam, which covers Unit 1 and Unit 2. So you have all of the study materials there on Blackboard. Each lecture, I give you the lecture notes with PowerPoint or PDF, whichever version of the file you want. There are also review videos for most of the lectures, and certainly for Unit 2, since we haven't been together for lecture since the very first week of Unit 2, all of the material that's fair game on the exam, that's all on Blackboard using those lecture notes and lecture videos. So you definitely want to go through all of that before you take the exam, right? You can only open the exam once, so do all of your studying up front and then open the exam when you are ready to go. I would also recommend setting aside like at least an hour and a half when you know that you're not going to have to get up and do something. Because once you close the exam, it can't be opened again. And so, if your computer gets shut down or whatever, you like, oh, I have to just like quick run an errand, it's going to close down the exam. So anyway, just, set aside an hour and a half, 2 hours to take the exam. No notes, no books, no Googling or internet searching when you take the exam. It's just like a regular exam in the classroom, but we're doing it on the computer. So I see we've already got a bunch of people online, which is excellent. Let me just pull up YouTube on my phone so that I can make sure I don't miss anyone's questions. But essentially, whenever you're ready, just type your questions into that little chat field, and I'll be able to answer them in real time, okay? So let me just your questions. All right, I think we are ready to go. Yeah. Let me see. Make sure I have my supplies. I've got my marker and my thingy. Okay. All right. I see our first question has come up. Hi, Cassandra. So this says, hey, professor, my question was, how were species created? Okay, this threw me for a loop because I couldn't figure out an answer that made the most sense. So this is something that is going to be, it's related to material from Unit 1. So if you're in one of my hybrid classes, this is going to be less important for you. But this is thinking back to the second lecture topic that we had, which was when we were talking about human diversity and the concept of race. And we talked about how, there's this Linnaean taxonomic system that we use in the biological sciences today. A taxonomy is just a way of categorizing living things. And the taxonomy that we use groups together animals or plants according to their similarities and their relatedness. But we talked about how these species, which is the smallest level of a taxonomy, how we sort of get a new species existing in the world, right? And you can even think of it something like wolves and dogs, right? We know that dogs come from wolves. Like, even if we're not scientists, we're just like, oh yeah, I mean, dogs clearly came from wolves, but they're very different from wolves. They look very different. So how do we get dogs from wolves? It's essentially the process of like creating a species is when you have, or one way that you can do it is when you have a group of animal, you have one species, and then that group becomes separated somehow, like it gets split in half. And then once it's split into those two groups, if they stay separated long enough, they start to develop differences between them. And as long as they're separated and they don't come back together and mix their genes, they will become more and more different, and their genes and their gene pools more and more different, to the point that if they were to come back together, then they wouldn't be able to reproduce. Now, of course, using the example of wolves and dogs, this highlights already a problem with our definition of species if we're saying that two different species shouldn't be able to reproduce, because we know that dogs and wolves can reproduce. But the methodology is still the same, that species are created when an original group sort of breaks into two or splinters, or one section of that group kind of starts adapting in a different way, because maybe it's in a different place or it's moving into a new environmental zone. And then as it changes, as it builds up those differences, it becomes so distinctly genetically separated from the original group that we would call it a new species. I hope that sort of answers your question. And, you know, in the context of human evolution, we have all of these species that were discussed on that family tree, which of course I now don't have sitting in front of me. We have all of those different species, and you know, we can't know what their genes looked like 3 million years ago or 5 million years ago, but we give those different species, or those different groups of fossil hominins, different species names because they have significant physical differences from one another. And so we say, all right, when we see this level of difference in the world today, we see that that happens in distinct species. And so that's why we name those fossil hominins as different species. I hope that helps, Cassandra. If not, we can come back to it. But really the idea is that to create a new species, you just have to have part of the original group kind of moving into some like new situation, whether it's a new environment or just a new environmental niche in that original area. They start doing something different from the rest of the group, and that causes them to adapt to be, you know, better for that environment. Okay, I see another question's come in. Can you review population genetics, Mendelian genetics? Yeah, here's the thing. Genes are important to understand sort of conceptually, but this is not a genetics class, and I am not going to be testing you on genetics on this exam, right? So even I think just like what you probably already know about genes just from living in the world that we live in, you know, 2020, we know more about genes and DNA just in like part of our casual conversation than people did 20 years ago. So what I would say the important parts of understanding about, you know, genes and genetics is that from an anthropological standpoint, you know, as those of us, as we're talking about how humans evolved over time, how human or hominin populations changed over time, we're not interested necessarily in, you know, what this person's genes were or that person's genes were or your genes or my genes. We're interested in what does the whole gene pool look like. And so another term for gene pool could be population genetics, right? What are the genetic codes that exist within this whole big group of individuals? And then what we're interested in is how does that gene pool or how do those population genetics change over time? So an example that I used in class was that, you know, about 100 years ago, approximately 50% of the American population had blue eyes. And today it's about 10%. That's a really big shift in population genetics, right? In 100 years to go from 50% blue eyes to 10% blue eyes, we want to know what is it that caused this significant change, because that's a pretty significant change. And so when we think about evolution in that sense, we're saying what is driving the changes in the gene pool. And so when it comes to something like eye color, that's when we bring in concepts like dominant and recessive genes, right? We know that dominant genes are the ones that when they are present, they always show up. So when it comes to eye color, brown eyes are dominant and blue eyes are recessive. So if you have a brown-eyed, like one brown-eyed gene and one blue-eyed gene coming together in a person, then that dominant brown-eyed gene is the one that should show up and the person will have brown eyes. That blue-eyed recessive gene hides in the background. And then in the future, when that person has kids, maybe they pass on that recessive blue-eyed gene. And if their partner also passes on a recessive blue-eyed gene, then the blue eyes show up in the kid. But the thing about recessive genes is that because they can hide in the background, they can sometimes carry characteristics that aren't necessarily beneficial or that aren't necessarily adaptive. And natural selection lets that happen. Natural selection only cares about the physical characteristic. So let me just do this really fast. Got two keywords here. So these words are genotype and phenotype. Now, the genotype is the genetic code for a characteristic. So, for example, if we're talking about eye color, big B, this is brown, brown. And it's capitalized. That's how we know that we're talking about the dominant trait there. Okay, so the genotype, the genetic code, is big B, this is a brown-eyed trait. The phenotype is the physical characteristic that results from the genotype. So that would be brown in this case. But there are other genotypes, for example, big B, little b. So you've got that dominant brown-eye gene, but you've got the recessive blue-eye gene. But because you have that dominant there, then it means that that person's eyes are going to be brown as well. So you can have two different genotypes that produce the same phenotype. Natural selection only cares about the phenotype, meaning that natural selection only cares what your characteristics look like or what they can do. It doesn't care what genes you have that support it, which means that, let's say that that blue-eyed recessive gene is really bad. Well, it can just hide in the background. As long as it's hiding behind the brown eyes, it just hides in the background, and then sometimes it pops up later. So that's why sometimes there are these like really, bad genetic diseases, and we might think, why haven't these things been sort of bred out of the population? Why haven't they been selected out if they're so bad? It's because they're recessive, and so they hide in the background until they're matched up with a similar gene. So, no, I just said you don't need to know a lot of genetics for the exam. That's still true. Even this, I think, is probably more than you need to know about genetics for the exam. As long as you know that, natural selection acts on the phenotype, meaning that, or that maybe that population genetics just looks at changes in the gene pool over time, you'll be fine. Yeah. Okay. All right, I have a couple more questions come in, so let me just get to those. And any of you, if you ask a question and I didn't answer it to your satisfaction, please do not hesitate to just be like, go back to that one. We gotta review, okay? Okay, so next question, what is habitus? All right, so again, I'm just gonna be explicit about this because this is something that's important for my Wednesday students. For my hybrid students, you've already covered habitus in your Unit 1 exam. But for my Wednesday folks, habitus came up when we were talking about the concept of culture. And there's that whole lecture of just like, what is culture, right? And a big list of characteristics or features of culture. So culture is learned, it's shared, it's all-encompassing, it's dynamic, it's symbolic, it's performed, it interacts with nature, right? All of those characteristics. In there was that, one of those characteristics was that culture is all-encompassing. And when we say culture is all-encompassing, we mean that culture isn't just like theater or literature or the arts. Culture is the technology that we use. Culture is the way we style our hair. Culture is the crappy TV that we watch. Culture is the way that we respond to pandemics, right? Culture is everything all around us. Everything that we do that's not genetically coded into us is culture. And so then habitus is a term that refers to all of those little everyday parts of culture that like we wouldn't even think about. If someone said, tell me about your culture, it's the stuff you would never think to say, oh, well, this is how we do this certain thing, because it's so natural to us that it's just like, like breathing. So I'm trying to think of a good example. Maybe how well, that's not necessarily a good example. Well, okay, so you know how in New York, You can always tell if someone's a tourist. Like if you're, Midtown or something, if you happen to be around the Empire State Building, you can always tell who's a tourist and who's from New York or who's lived in New York for a long time. How? Because the tourists, and I say this as someone who is not from New York originally, you always know who the tourists are because they're always looking up, right? Looking up at the tall buildings. And you can tell also by like how the speed at which people walk, right? New Yorkers walk fast. It's like, I got to get going. I got to get that train. I got to get over here. I got to do this. And people who aren't from New York tend, often kind of have a little bit more of a mosey to them. Now, that's not something necessarily that if someone said, tell me about life in New York, you wouldn't say, oh, well, we always just like look down. We never smile at people and we walk really fast and we never look up at skyscrapers and, we'll like push someone out of the way. It's like that little everyday stuff that you learn from growing up in this culture, but it wouldn't necessarily be like the thing that you say, here's how we define our culture. Does that make sense? It's the little everyday stuff. It's how you hold your knife. It's how you tie your shoes. It's how you hold, your cup. Like, do you put your pinky up or not? Little everyday stuff. The habits. I mean, it has the same root there, right? Habits. Okay, next question. Can you explain mutation and how that produces variation? And can you explain random genetic drift? Absolutely. Okay. So this is something that, this comes from Unit 2, from the lecture Evolutionary Processes and Genetics, okay? So I've been asked about these two particular mechanisms of genetic evolution. But what I want to do is try to put this in a little bit more of like a cohesive framework, because I think that if you are able to understand how all these concepts go together, they make more sense. And I want to encourage you to do this with all of your studying, not just with this one specific topic, okay? So, excuse me. What I'm going to do, and I don't have a lot of room to write on my little whiteboard here, but let's try to make like a little bit of a concept map around this idea of evolution, okay? So we're going to put in the middle here, mech for mechanisms, right? That's MEC. Okay, mechanisms of genetic evolution, right? So this is our main subject here in the middle. And there are 4 mechanisms of genetic evolution. 1, 2, 3, and 4. The first is natural selection, right? The second is mutation. Third is random genetic drift. And fourth is gene flow. Okay, so what I'm doing with this sort of concept map is I'm putting my main idea, which is I want to describe what these 4 mechanisms of genetic evolution are, and then I'm putting each of them sort of around this. And I can even draw a line so I know that I'm talking about that each of these is one type of genetic evolution. And again, by genetic evolution, we just mean the way that gene pools change over time. So if I were doing this on a sheet of paper, which is what I would encourage you to do as you're studying, because you always learn and remember things more if you're actually writing them down and not just typing them out, writing them out by hand. There's something about the wiring between your hand and your brain that makes it stick more, okay? So what I would then do would be to make a list of like the different types of natural selection. So you have things like directional selection. That's an A, and then I just put directional selection. B is sexual selection. C is stabilizing selection. D is disruptive selection, okay? Mutation is what was just asked about in this question. And I'm sorry, I should also say, if you're doing this on a piece of notebook paper, what you can then do, because you'll be able to write more neatly and small and in the right position, then you can just put your definition or an example sort of after this. You'd say directional selection and you would write the definition for what it is. I don't know. That's just how I study. I like visual things. And if I am able to sort of connect concepts, it makes more sense. Okay, so let's come to this concept of mutation. A mutation is essentially just a mistake. It's a genetic mistake that happens at the time of reproduction. So if you think about the point of reproduction, if we're talking about, humans, mammals, animals, male, female come together, and they're sharing part of their genetic code. So each female is passing on half of her DNA, and the male's passing on half of his DNA. And those two halves come together, right? So in all of us, we've got these like two parts of our genetic code, one from our mom, one from our dad. When that DNA is passed along to us, it's meant to be an exact copy. It's supposed to be a 100% faithful copy of the genes that we got from mom or from dad. But sometimes when those copies are being made, errors are introduced. There are errors in the copies, and that error is what we call a mutation. So also, if you remember to that lizard drawing that we did, right? Every time one of you drew the lizard that you were copying from whoever came before you, you all introduced tiny errors. Those errors are mutations. And mutations create the variation that natural selection can act upon. Okay? Most of the time, when those mutations occur, they don't do anything. You don't even know that they're there. But sometimes those mutations take some, a mother has blue eyes, and then the mutation comes along and the child has purple eyes. Or one mutation could produce like extra fingers on a hand, or a mutation could produce extra hairy armpits, or whatever it is. Genetic mutations create the differences that we see in individuals around the world. Okay, so if it weren't for mutations, we would all still be these little single-celled amoebas floating in a pond somewhere. We wouldn't be humans, and we wouldn't have mushrooms, and we wouldn't have salamanders or horses or daffodils. Mutations produce all of the variation that's seen biologically, and then natural selection comes along and says, thank you, mutation, I'm going to take this one. Like, this one works for me, and it's better than all the ones that came before. Or this mutation, no, that one sucks, get rid of that one. Okay, so mutations are genetic mistakes that create variation in a population. And then random genetic, okay, so what I would do then, I would have, my like definition of mutation there, but then maybe I could say mutation, like mutation creates variation that natural selection needs. I don't know, something like that. You find your own way to do it. But if you use a concept chart like this, you can kind of start to draw between these different concepts to explain how they relate to each other, because they do relate to each other. Okay. So then random genetic drift, here's another good way to, or reason to draw a concept map. We know that natural selection is when characteristics that are beneficial are selected for, meaning individuals who have the good characteristics, they survive better and they have more babies into the next generation. So the good genes are favored in natural selection. Random genetic drift is the opposite, okay? So I could draw like a line between these two, and then I write in the word opposite. Because in random genetic drift, it's not the good genes necessarily that get put forth to the next generation. It's whatever genes happen to be there because of some random event. So let's say that, you've got, you've got this nice big gene pool, and then, like 100 individuals, really beautiful, robust, deep, wide gene pool. And then 7 of those 100 people are like, you know what? The rest of you guys, we think you're boring. We think you're lame. We're going to go over here and start a new society. When they peel off those 7 people, suddenly their gene pool has gone from really big and robust to really small. And so whatever population comes from those 7 people down the line, it's coming from whatever genes they have. Not because they're good, not because they're the best, but just because it's what happens to be there. So in that sense, random genetic drift, is sort of the opposite of natural selection, okay? All right, I hope that was useful, but I can come back to any of that if you want me to. Okay, all right, I'm looking ahead, and Prince, I'm not ignoring your question. I will get to that in just a minute, but I see someone else is asking about, I was wondering if those 4 types of natural selection will have to be explained briefly or remembered for multiple choice. I would say multiple choice would be a more likely place that you would see something about, you know, these different types of natural selection. More so, though, I would say get comfortable with what natural selection is, right? Or those conditions of natural selection. So in class, we use the example of bunnies, right? Bunnies that reproduce, and they'll reproduce endlessly, as we were talking about sort of how natural selection plays out in an environment. So let me do this really fast just to sort of refresh your memory. And this is also in the video on the mechanisms of genetic evolution. So the example we use, we are going to chart the number of bunnies, here's my little bunny, over time. Okay, so this is starting point 0, and this is moving forward in time. And we're going to start with 2 bunnies, because we know if we get 2 bunnies, we stick them in a room together, eventually we're going to have a lot of little baby bunnies, right? That's what bunnies do, they reproduce. So that's the first condition of natural selection, that populations reproduce infinitely. A population of bunnies will just keep having babies, and they're not going to stop, you know, left to their own devices. They're just going to keep going and keep going. So you start with 2, pretty soon you have 6, then you have 1,000,000. The next part of that, though, is that while populations increase infinitely, resources are finite, okay? So resources could be things like the availability of mates, or the availability of shelter, or really food, right? Food is one of the main resources that every animal has to get. So we're going to say our little bunnies eat carrots. And in this environment, there's only enough carrots to feed 100 bunnies. So we're going to draw a little line, sort of set that threshold there. So what this is telling us is that when there are only 2 bunnies, there's enough carrots for everyone. When there's 30 bunnies, still more than enough carrots. 80 bunnies, everyone's happy, everyone has a full belly. Until we get to bunny number 101 and 102, suddenly there's not enough carrots for everyone, because there's only carrots for the first 100, okay? So populations increase infinitely, but resources are finite. The next part of natural selection is that within this population of bunnies, there's going to be variation, which, remember from mutation, all of that variation comes from mutations that just automatically exist in the population, okay? So variation exists in this population. Some of these bunnies have bigger ears. Some of these bunnies have floppier tails. Some of these bunnies are brown and some are gray. We could also imagine that some of our bunnies eat meat. We've got these little vampire bunnies, okay? And so when there's some variation in the population, then natural selection kicks in when some variants lead to greater success and more reproductive opportunities. So when we have 101 bunnies, those bunnies that can only eat carrots, they're not getting enough food. But suddenly if we have bunnies that don't need those carrots because they can find another food resource, like their vegetarian friends, well, then they're going to be more successful. Their resources aren't limited. So they're going to keep surviving, and they're going to keep reproducing. And they're going to pass on their genes more often into the next generation. And if that keeps happening and keeps happening and keeps happening, where one variant is more successful than another variant, then eventually the whole species is going to end up having that variant as their main characteristic, okay? So those are the conditions of natural selection, and I think that would be an important part to to have sort of fixed in your brain, leading into this exam. Okay, let me quickly go back to this question that's a bit more about, it's more like logistics of the class. So this is not about the test, but I'm really glad that this question came up because I sent everyone an email today, and I know I just can't stop sending you emails, and really long emails, and I know they're annoying, and I know you don't want to read the whole thing, but I have so much that I want to tell you and so much to communicate. So I tried to keep it short, and for a couple of you, the image didn't load properly, but it's up on Blackboard now. I found out today, and you may have received other emails since mine got sent through to you, that CUNY has decided on a flexible grading policy, okay? And this is a good thing. This is a really good thing because it takes a little bit of stress off of all of us. I have to imagine that a lot of people, not only at Hostos, but at every CUNY school, a lot of people are really concerned about what this switch to fully online instruction is going to do to their grades. And not only just their grade in this one class, but their overall GPA. A lot of people are looking to maintain a high GPA or looking to bring a lower GPA back up. Whatever it is, having this really big transition to online instruction absolutely is reason to kind of stress about what that's going to mean for success, right? So the flexible grading policy that's just been implemented is a response to that. And essentially it means at the end of the semester, okay, so this is not anything you have to decide until the very end of the semester when you already have received your grade. Once you see the grade that you have earned in this class or any of your other classes, then you can decide if you want that letter grade to be the grade on your transcript, or if you want to take the class credit or no credit, okay? So essentially, if you get to the end of the semester and you get a D in one of your classes, and you're like, man, I really needed to get like a B in this class, to help my GPA. This is totally going to drag my GPA down, or whatever it is. At that point, you can say, you know what? I'm not going to take the D. I'm going to take this class credit. And so that just means that it's going to show up on your transcript. It's going to count as a class that you have taken, and it's not going to affect your GPA. So it's not going to increase your GPA, and it's not going to decrease your GPA. It also shouldn't mess anything up in terms of like transferring credits, but you'd want to just confirm that just to be sure. But it's basically a way of saying, like, we know this is a screwed up semester, but you showed up, and you did the work, and so you're getting credit for it. Now, if you get an A in one of your classes, I would say probably just keep the A, right? If you take the letter grade, then it will affect your GPA. So if you get an A in the class, I would say don't take the class credit or no credit, because you would want that to bring your GPA up. But also, let's say it comes to the end of the semester and things just didn't come together for you, and you get an F in a class. If you change to that credit, no credit option, then that class is just going to show up as a no credit on your transcript, and it's not going to drag down your GPA. So the flexible grading policy is meant to relieve a little bit of stress for all of us. There's still a reason to try, right? There's still a benefit to doing well in your classes, because you can still have your letter grade that you earn on your transcript, and that can still be helpful to you. But if things go real weird in a way that you don't want them to, you can choose to take the credit, no credit option, and it will, your transcripts will still show that you took the class, even if that letter grade isn't being represented. Does that make sense? I hope it. That's what I understood from reading through the policy. And here's, again, the great thing. You don't have to make this decision until after your final grades have come in. So it's not like you have to sit here before you're taking the midterm exam going, oh, I don't know, should I change to credit? I don't know how I'm going to do. It just means ride through the semester, do your best, put in the work, put in as much as you can, And then when we get to the end of the semester, then you make the decision about how you want to deal with it, okay? It just frees us all up, and it means that we don't have to stress as much just right now, okay? I really do want everyone to try. This exam is going to be hard, and probably a lot of people are going to be like, oh, that sucks. I don't know if I should keep going with this. Keep going with this, okay? We will find our way. I promise you we will find our way in this class, okay? All right, and if anyone has any other questions about the flexible grading policy, shoot me an email or talk to me during the online office hours. I'm happy to do my best to explain. I'm not an authority. I just read it today, but I'll do what I can, okay? Oh, I see. So is it possible to have just the credit for one class and letter grades for the rest? Yes, that's my understanding. So it's like if you're taking 4 classes and you get 3 A's, and then one of your classes you get like a C or a D, you're like, I just can't have that show up on my transcript. Yeah, you can do that one credit, no credit. And there's going to be a little letter attached to your transcript that says like, hey, in spring 2020, New York was going crazy. And so that's why some students have like credits or no credits. It's supposed to not hurt you. That's the whole point, is to make sure that no one gets hurt in this transition to online teaching, okay? All right. So let me make sure that I'm catching up. We talked about mutation. We talked about random genetic drift and the 4 types of natural selection. So understanding those conditions of natural selection. And let's see. Do you have to know anything about, remember sexual selection, right? Sexual selection is like natural selection that acts only on males or females. And so sexual selection ends up producing this really big physical difference between males and females. Think about peacocks. Male peacocks have those big, beautiful tails, bright, beautiful colors. Female peacocks, or peahens, are really bland and boring and beige, and they're not very special looking. That's because the males are competing with each other to figure out who gets to have sex with the females, right? They're like showing off to the ladies, being like, hey, you want to have babies with me. Because if you have babies with me, your babies are going to be attractive just like I am. So sexual selection acts only on males or females because they're competing with each other for who gets to have sex and pass on their genes. Sexual selection, sorry, I keep starting the same sentence over and over again. That big physical difference between males and females is called sexual dimorphism, right? So if we say that a species is sexually dimorphic, it means that males and females look really different. So for example, humans, we are a little bit sexually dimorphic. Not as much as peacocks, not as much as gorillas, but a little bit. Like for the most part, we can tell people who are biologically male and people who are biologically female based on physical characteristics. And actually, that ties into the forensic anthropology material, which is also on the exam. Please don't forget forensic anthropology, right? The very first part of the forensic anthropology lecture is how to distinguish male skeletons from female skeletons. The reason we can do that is because of that slight sexual dimorphism in humans, okay? So I'm not going to talk more about forensic anthropology just yet because I want to make sure that I get to these other questions. But if someone does want to talk forensic anthropology, let me know and we'll loop back around to it. Okay, another question. Can you explain the difference between Out of Africa 1 and Out of Africa 2? Absolutely. So both of these things, out of Africa, are migration events that took place during the course of human evolution, or I should say hominin evolution, right? I really wish I had like some better technology set up here so that I could do something fancy. That's all right, I'll talk through it. Okay, so we know, all of us, right, that we originally come from Africa, right? All humans come from Africa. 90% of hominin evolution occurred in Africa. The earliest hominins, Sahelanthropus chadensis, That is an African species. And from the first hominins 6-7 million years ago up until about 2 million years ago, all of that hominin evolution was taking place in Africa. So that's Aurorantuganensis, Ardipithecus cadaba, Ardipithecus ramidus, all of the Australopithecus species like Australopithecus afarensis, Australopithecus africanus, Australopithecus diarrhea, Australopithecus sediba, all of those Australopithecus, which you don't have to remember all of their specific names. And then the Paranthropus species like Paranthropus boisei and robustus, and Ethiopicus, the ones with the little mohawks on their heads and the really, really big cheekbones. All that's happening in Africa, right? Then around 2.5, 2.3 million years ago, we see the first members of the genus Homo appearing in Africa, the first things that are more similar to us. And so they're grouped in our same genus of Homo. So first, there was some Homo thing around 2.3, 2.5 million years ago, which doesn't have a specific name. Then we get Homo habilis, the handyman, right? The little, still little kind of apey guy, short, slightly bigger brain, but they were definitely using tools. Then there's Homo rudolfensis, and then we get to Homo ergaster, also known as Homo erectus. This species is so cool and so important because this looks like the group that, to my mind, is really, really looking more human, not only physically, but behaviorally. They're doing things in ways that are much more similar to how our species does things, okay? So let me just write that down. That is H for Homo ergaster, also known as Homo erectus. And for our purposes on this exam, either one of these names are just fine. So if you find yourself wanting to talk about Homo ergaster or Homo erectus, you can use either name and I'll give you full credit for it, okay? Often people will use Homo ergaster to refer to the African members of that group, and then Homo erectus to refer to things sort of outside of Africa. But I've already kind of given you a little bit of a spoiler about why this group is important. Because in addition to their more human-like behaviors, like more sophisticated stone tools and eventually the controlled use of fire, we also see a big encephalization trend with this species where you have brain sizes going up to about 1,000 cubic centimeters. Compared to the Australopithecus species that came, just before them, that's almost double the size of Australopithecus brains, or in some cases more than double the size. So we've got this big increase in brain size, more sophisticated tools. There's probably also more social cohesion. They're getting better access to animal proteins, and they're also the first group to move outside of the African continent, okay? And this is called the Out of Africa 1 migration. So as the name suggests, we have an Out of Africa 1, we're gonna have an Out of Africa 2 a little bit later down the line. But Out of Africa 1 takes some of the Homo ergaster that were in Africa, and some of them move sort of up and west into Europe, some move up and east into Asia, and then some also end up moving down. I really wish I had a map of the world. Do I not have a single map in this room of just the world? I don't. Okay, so you have Homo ergaster moving up into Europe and then over to Asia and some down into Indonesia. But there were still Homo ergaster in Africa, okay? So Out of Africa 1 just takes them basically throughout the old world, except not Australia. Out of Africa 1 happens at 1.8 million years ago, which is right around the same time they show up in Africa. So it's like as soon as Homo ergaster shows up in Africa, as soon as this species evolves from preceding species with these big brains, with this greater social cohesion, with this ability to get better food resources, they start spreading. Now, it's not that Homo ergaster, shows up in Africa and then they go, let's go to China. I've heard it's beautiful. Or I've always, wanted to go to France or whatever. They just slowly are moving. Maybe just every generation, every 20 years, move 5 miles that way. And then the family grows. And so 20 years later, we move 5 miles this way. If it's this very slow, sort of just like spreading, it actually doesn't take that long to get a species to migrate across that really big geographic area. So as you have ergaster spreading out into Europe, into Asia, into Indonesia, now you have all these different populations of Homo ergaster, and they keep evolving, right? Just because they move doesn't mean they stop evolving. So in Europe, ergaster continues to evolve into like erectus, what we would call it, and then antecessor and heidelbergensis, and eventually the Neanderthals, Homo neanderthalensis. Those are the descendants of Homo ergaster. In Asia, you get what's called like the classic Homo erectus, but then you have some of the Homo erectus that gets stuck on little islands in Indonesia. So Homo floresiensis, that little dwarfed hobbit species that lived until about 50,000 years ago, that's a descendant of Homo erectus from that out of Africa 1 migration. And it's also an example of random genetic drift, because you have this big Homo erectus population and then only a couple of them get stuck on this small island. And now evolution has to proceed with a much smaller gene pool. It goes really fast and they go from big to real small. It's one of the weird things about evolution. When big things get stuck on islands, they tend to become small, and small things tend to become big. So that's all out of Africa 1, right? And we've still got ergaster in Africa, even after some of them move out. Ergaster continues to evolve in Africa. And then around 300,000 years ago, a new species appears, or a new species evolves, emerges in Africa, and that's us, the Homo sapiens. And our species lives throughout the African continent for a long time. For like 200,000 years, Homo sapiens seem to be just kind of chilling in Africa, living in all these different environments and with all these different types of stone tool technologies and symbolic behavior. And then around 70,000 years ago, let's say, some members of our species Homo sapiens migrate out of the African continent, and that's out of Africa 2. And in out of Africa 2, Homo sapiens move up just the same way that Homo ergaster did, out of Africa, with some of them swinging west into Europe, some of them swinging east into Asia, and some of them making it all the way down into Australia. Okay, so with both of these migrations, they're just movement of hominins from the original source of Africa into the rest of the world. And just to be real clear, let me just write down the necessary names and dates on this whiteboard, okay? So we've got Homo ergaster / erectus. That was out of Africa 1, right? Out of Africa 1, 1.8 million years ago. Then we've got H. Homo sapiens, that's us. And this was out of Africa 2. And let's say around 70,000 years ago, KYA. And they're essentially going the same place, Europe and Asia, but then with Homo sapiens, they also go to Australia. Okay. If anyone has any other questions about the out of Africas or anything like that, add them in and we'll loop back to it. All right. Let me just get some tea. Okay. Here's a question. Can you explain Cribra orbitalia? It was a keyword on the review, but I might have missed it in the forensic lectures. I couldn't find the explanations when I Googled it. Absolutely, I can. Okay, so let me, and I'm sorry, Ashrat, because you asked a very specific question, and I'm going to expand my response. The forensic anthropology lecture, there's one set of PowerPoint notes, but there's 2 videos. So it's like a 2-parter on the videos, but they're not super long. They're like 20 some minutes each, okay? please, 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 everyone go through that material. There is absolutely forensic anthropology on the exam. Because forensic anthropology is so cool. It is absolutely fascinating what we can know about a person based on just their skeleton. It's wild. Okay, so what I want you to know about forensic anthropology, and you can think of it as how these two videos are set up. In the first video is a discussion of how you identify a person based on their skeleton. So that means how you determine a person's sex, meaning male or female, how you determine a person's age, how you determine a person's physical stature, like their height, and then how you estimate a person's ancestry, meaning is this person, like, is their ancestry European or African or Asian? And all of these are estimates, right? We're all extremely variable. So even something like determining a person's sex. If I'm looking at a skeleton and I want to say this person is female or this person is male, that's still an estimate. We would say this person has features that are more similar to females, or this person has features more similar to males. What I want each of you to be able to do is to be able to explain a couple parts on the skeleton, specifically where you can determine or estimate a person's sex or age or ancestry. Okay? So just for example, hypothetically, if you saw a question on an exam that said, hey, tell me how you would determine if a skeleton was male or female, it would not be sufficient for you to say, oh, look at their bones. Yeah, that's the question, right? Like, what about their bones? What is it about their bones that would tell you that they are male or female? And so maybe you'd say, like, okay, well, I'd look at their pelvis. Good start. But what about the pelvis? Like, give me the details. So maybe you would say, oh, I would look at the pubic arch, which is the space sort of below where the pelvis comes together in the front of the pubic symphysis. And there's a piece of cartilage in between. All of us have this, and you can feel around on yourself if you want to. It's just where your pelvis comes together in the front. Below that is the pubic arch. And so if the pubic arch is more U-shaped, then that is more likely to be a female pelvis, because women in general have pelvises that are just more open. It's not that our hips are necessarily bigger, they're just more open, and that's because they need to be able to, facilitate a child moving through there in the birthing process. So women have a U-shaped pelvic arch and men have a more constricted V-shaped pelvic arch. That's a specific characteristic that indicates a person's sex. That would be a perfect thing to know for the exam. Or I would estimate a person's age by looking at their teeth. I know that the first molar, which is one of the chewing teeth in the adult dentition back here, the first molar erupts when a person is 6 years old. The second molar, on average, erupts when a person is 12. And the third molar, or wisdom tooth, on average erupts when people are 18 years old. So based on the molars that they have, I could determine their age. Something like that. You see, I want the specifics, okay? So that's the first chunk of the forensic anthropology lecture, is figuring out those individual characteristics. The second part is about assessing the types of damage that can exist on a skeleton. And this is important, figuring out, especially for answering questions about like how someone has died, or what has happened to a person in their lifetime, or what's happened to a body after the person has died. So if you ever watch the TV show Bones, if you haven't, it's fantastic because it's like very formulaic, like the same thing happens in every episode. Like some kid's riding a bike and then he falls in a gross squishy skeleton, and then Bones comes in and she goes, oh, I can tell by the sciatic notch, I can tell by the constriction of the sciatic notch, this is a 30-year-old male who spent his life as a boxer. Okay, that's an awful lot to say about someone just looking at their skeleton. What she's doing, though, is identifying the person's sex based on physical characteristics that are more typical of males, but she's also looking at identifying characteristics that tell you about who this, like what this person did in their lifetime or how they died. So there are three types of damage that can exist on a skeleton, and they're all important. I'm going to sneeze. Excuse me. It's a slow burn. Excuse me. Okay. There's 3 types of damage that can exist on a skeleton. And we call these ante-mortem damage, peri-mortem damage, and post-mortem damage. Now, mortem means death, okay? So ante-mortem means before death. Perimortem means at the time of death. And post-mortem means after death. Ante-mortem damage, that's all the stuff you survive. That's when you break your arm when you're 8 years old and it doesn't kill you because it's just a broken arm. Cool. But you're going to have maybe a little scar on the bone tissue. That's ante-mortem damage. And that's something that a forensic anthropologist might be able to see. So sometimes, you know, like there's like medical shows and someone comes into the ER and they take x-rays and they go, oh, we could tell that this, you know, this guy's broken 7 ribs in the last few years. It's because there's like scar tissue that builds up on those ribs and you can see injuries that have healed. That's all ante-mortem damage or ante-mortem injury. Cribra orbitalia is an example of ante-mortem damage. Cribra orbitalia, and I encourage you to look at the notes because it's in there. Cribra orbitalia is a type of ante-mortem damage that can tell us a little bit about a person's lifestyle or a community's sort of life history. Cribra orbitalia is a condition that occurs as a result of very long-term iron anemia. So essentially iron deficiency. You know, we need certain nutrients in our bodies to be healthy. And one of those nutrients that we need is iron. However, if we don't get enough iron, if we're extremely, extremely iron deficient and we become extremely iron anemic, our body might actually try to get iron that's sort of stored elsewhere in our body. And that's what Cribra orbitalia is. In this case, the body is so starved for iron that it tries to pull it out from the bone that already exists. So Cribra orbitalia tends to start in the eye sockets, and it's not something you'd see from the outside, but when all of the flesh is removed, inside the eye sockets, it looks like a sponge, like a kitchen sponge with all these little holes. And essentially that's bone tissue that the body has dissolved away to try to satisfy its iron needs. So if we find an individual with Cribra orbitalia, also called parodic hyperostosis, it tells us that that person was iron deficient for a very long time. It's often an indicator of severe, severe malnutrition, okay? So it's telling us something about what that person's life was like. It also might be an indicator that a person was sick for a very long time. So for example, if someone grew up living in really, really poor hygienic conditions, and someone was essentially sick, like if someone had diarrhea for their entire life because there's just like really crappy sanitary conditions around them. If you have diarrhea your entire life, your body never gets a chance to really absorb all the nutrients that it has because your body's just trying to like flush out all of the bad stuff, all the poison, right? And so that leads to severe malnutrition and iron anemia. And then Cribra orbitalia could result from that, okay? So Cribra orbitalia is it's caused by iron anemia, and it's a type of ante-mortem damage. Now, perimortem damage, I'm sorry, let me also say this. I would really encourage you to look at all those various types of ante-mortem and other types of damage that are included in that lecture. There are some really good images in the lecture that show you what each type of damage looks like. Okay, so for example, skull deformation. This is a practice that's happened all around the world where you can intentionally shape a person's skull to make it form in a certain way, as long as you do it when they're babies. And so in Peru, for example, hundreds of years ago, they used to wrap baby skulls with pieces of fabric, and that would force the skull up into this kind of like cone head shape. And that would be considered a sign of like beauty or elite status. That is also ante-mortem damage because it's modification to the skeleton because of some cultural belief, but it's something that happened during a person's lifetime. Perimortem damage, that's damage that occurs at or around the time of death. So it's like the injury that kills you, essentially. Like if I get into a car accident and break a bunch of bones and I die in that car accident, all of those injuries would be perimortem injuries. Perimortem injuries, they look like antemortem injuries. They look fresh, but they never get a chance to heal. Okay. Now, fresh breaks, when our bones are juicy and wet and alive and they break in some really characteristic patterns. And specifically, they break in these sort of spiral patterns. Actually, I think I have some bones. Hold on. This is not nearly as creepy as it sounds. Is this my bag of bones? Okay. Do I have ante-mortem, perimortem breaks? Yes. Of course I, ooh, okay. All right. So you see this little bone? This is not human. This is like from a goat or something, okay? But this animal bone, you see how it's angled like this? That angled or spiral break is something that happens. It's the fracture dynamics that occur because this bone was broken like this right after this animal died, okay? Or like right around the time that this animal died. So the bone hadn't started to decay. It hadn't started to dry out yet. It was still fresh. Fresh bones have angled breaks. And we know that this is a perimortem break and not an antemortem break, both of which would be fresh, but we know it's perimortem because it never healed, right? We have this broken bone and it never healed. So that is perimortem. Now, postmortem breaks, those are also breaks that never heal because they happen after someone has died. But postmortem breaks happen differently. They don't happen at an angle. They're more like flat. You see how this isn't angled like that? It's just like perpendicular to the rest of the bone. That's a post-mortem break, and they break flat like that when the bone is dried out, when the bone has already started to like lose its collagen inside. Okay, so that's how you tell the difference between perimortem and post-mortem breaks. And again, I promise it's not creepy. These are just animal bones that I had for a project because I'm an archaeologist. Okay? Don't call the police or anything. Okay, that was a very long-winded explanation on my part. But hopefully that also gives you a little indicator of like parts that you need to focus on. Yeah. Okay. Make sure I didn't miss any questions here. Grab this on my phone. Okay, I think I'm caught up with all of the questions so far. Make sure I'm... Okay. These have been really great questions, you all. Really, really good. So who's got another question? We'll tell you what, while you all think of some questions, let me do a real quick break. I'm going to get myself some more water, and I will be right back in like 2 minutes, okay? And even if I'm not here, you can load your questions up, and then I can just like get through them when I come back. Quick break. Back in a minute. Oh, now I need to find something to put this up there. There we go. All right. I'll be right back, folks. All right, my friends, I'm back. Okay. I see a couple questions. The first looks logistic. Any ideas on what we'll be studying after exam 2? No, I don't know. We still have to make it up. No, I know what we're studying after exam 2. The first thing we're going to kick into next week is linguistic anthropology. We're going to talk about language, and we're going to spend like a little bit over a week talking about language, which should be cool. I love linguistic anthropology. I think you'll really enjoy it too. And I'll also be, just a heads up, I was going to give you some extra credit on forensic anthropology. I think I'm going to save that for next week, but some more extra credit is coming. I just felt like if I gave you extra credit right now, it would just be too much. So there's extra credit coming next week, okay? And then after we go through that, we'll be talking more about things, doing more cultural anthropology stuff, talking about like sex and gender and kinship and like how food really influences human culture. And we'll be talking about different ways that humans get food and how those systems have developed. And then at the end of the semester, we'll be talking about ethnicity a little bit. We'll be talking about religion. So we're covering a wide spectrum here. Okay, see a question. Can you discuss disruptive selection versus stabilizing selection? Yes. Let me say, I don't think that there are specific questions on disruptive or stabilizing selection. So I could probably shut up right now, but I'm going to talk anyway. Disruptive selection and stabilizing selection are both types of natural selection where some genetic characteristics, some physical characteristics are more useful than others, and so those get put forth into the next generation, but they are opposites of one another. Okay, so disruptive and stabilizing selection do different things. In stabilizing selection, basically, the good trait is to be average, and in disruptive selection, it's bad to be average. You want to be at one end of the extreme or another. So examples of stabilizing selection would be like in the size of babies' heads. If we think about a normal, this is called a normal distribution, where on the left side, like the higher the line is, that means the more number of individuals who have that particular characteristic. So at this end, it means that there are only a few individuals who have this version of the characteristic. And at this end, there's only a few individuals who have this extreme of the characteristic, but a lot of people have the average, sort of like the middle characteristic. We could say for height in humans, this is how it works, right? Some humans are only 3 feet tall, full grown. Some humans are 8 feet tall, full grown. But there's not many people who are 3 feet tall and not many people who are 8 feet tall. Most people are in the middle, between like 5 feet tall and 6'4" or whatever it is. I'm making those numbers up. But most people are in the middle. In stabilizing selection, it says it's really bad to be down here and it's really bad to be up here. So those individuals get selected out, meaning they essentially die before they get a chance to pass along their genes. That forces the entire group to become more average. They become concentrated around that average mean. So you have more individuals at that very middle range. We see this in the size of babies' heads. We don't want babies with super, super small heads because that affects their cognitive and physical development, right? We have big, beautiful brains. They need to be big. So we don't want super small-headed babies. But we also don't want super giant-headed babies either. We don't want babies trying to come out of the birth canal with heads the size of basketballs. They're not going to make it, right? Most of human history, we haven't had C-sections. And so those super basketball-headed babies, they wouldn't have survived the birth process. And so their genes get eliminated as well. Most babies, when they're born, have around the same size head. It's not too small, but it's not too big. It's just right. It's kind of like a Goldilocks thing, right? Like not too hot, not too cold, just right. In disruptive selection, it's the exact opposite. In disruptive selection, let me do this again. There's my normal distribution. It's really bad to be average. And instead, you want to be on the small end or the large end. And we see this in orangutan males, where you have some males that are the really big, sexy alphas. They're a lot heavier than the females. They've got really long hair. They've got the big hanging neck flap and the big cheek flanges. I don't know why female orangutans find this sexy, but apparently they do. So the really sexy alpha orangutans are like these really big guys. They move really slow. But the reason why they're all big like that, they have this sort of like, you could say a harem of females. That's a single male with multiple females, and he's the only one that's allowed to reproduce with any of them. But obviously there's all these other orangutan males that also want to pass on their genes. So they've evolved this characteristic where some males, they never get big like this. Instead, they stay really small. They look more like females or more like adolescents. They look like females. The reason why they do this is because if you had an orangutan male who was like average sized, not the biggest, but not the smallest, just like average in the middle. If he sees a female in this male's group and he wants to try to have sex with her, before he ever gets close to her, the big guy's going to see him. He's going to chase him off. The only reason you'd ever want to be a male that directly challenges this big male is if you knew you could beat him in a fight and essentially take over his group. So it's a bad idea to be middle-sized or smaller than this biggest male. So they've evolved this characteristic where some males stay looking more like females, because then one of these guys wants to pass on his genes and he wanders into the big dude's territory. Big guy looks at him and he's like, who's that chick? I've never seen her before. That's cool. I'll introduce myself later. And so the little guys, because they look like the females, they can just sneak their way into the group, find a female, they quickly have sex with her, and then they get out of there. They do their business and finish before this guy, because he's so big, he's real slow, before he can ever get to, break them up. So now he's passing on his genes because he's a big one, but these little guys are passing on their genes as well, because they're able to sneak in and out before the big one can figure out what's going on. So what that creates is a scenario where being average is bad because you're alerting the male to your presence. And you want to either be small or big. So you see no individuals at the average size, but you see a lot of individuals at either the small end or the big end. And that's disruptive selection. So natural selection, it's not just always about like who's biggest, who's best, who's fastest, who's strongest. There are all these different ways that animals or plants can be the best adapted to their environment. And sometimes that means being the one that can sneak around and reproduce without anyone noticing. And that happens a lot in nature. There are a lot of animals where males pretend to be females so that they can reproduce on the sly. Great, great questions. Let me see. So for Unit 2, you're welcome. For Unit 2, it was, so thinking about my hybrids, you have evolutionary processes on the exam. So that's what we're talking about just now, right? With natural selection, mutation, random genetic drift, and gene flow. You have early hominin evolution and the genus Homo. So all of that, like 7 million years of hominin evolution. And you've got forensic anthropology. And we've talked about all of those. That's good. For my Wednesday class, because yours is a straight up midterm that covers everything from the beginning of the semester, it's a lot. I'm not gonna try to sugarcoat it. It's a lot of material. But it's doable. It's definitely doable. Even if you're just like kind of ramping up your studying right now, it's still doable. Use the study guide, use the lecture notes with the review questions at the end. If you can answer those review questions, then you'll be in a good position. And you know what? I talked to someone about this the other day. Someone is asking me like how do I study for this exam? How am I supposed to use these resources? Everyone has their own study style, and I'm not going to try to say that my style is necessarily the best for everyone. And Lord knows it took me a long time to figure out what my best study style was. One of the funny things is, I don't know if it's ironic, but when you start teaching, like in what I do now, people always say like that's when you really learn a subject. Like you really understand something in depth once you start teaching it. And it's very, very true. So if I have any advice to you in studying for this exam, I would say, think about all of these subjects. How would you teach someone else about it? And not just how would you teach someone else in the class, or how would you explain it to me using all of the fancy words that we're supposed to use, but how would you explain it to an 8-year-old, right? Just like in regular everyday language. If you can explain these concepts in your own words and, come up with examples that make sense to you. If you can explain what these things mean to someone who has no experience with it whatsoever, that's when it's going to make real sense to you, because you come up with examples, right? Like, I use a lot of examples as we're going through these things, because just strings of words don't tend to make a lot of sense. And a lot of the examples I use are things that I've sort of thought of over the years as I've taught this class. So if you have a question on the study guide that says, like, what is natural selection? You could go to the textbook, or you could go to the lecture notes, and you could just write down word for word, natural selection is when there's an adaptive advantage that results in greater success and differential reproductive success for some individuals. Okay, but what does that mean? Right? What does it mean? I'm much less interested in you memorizing the words that I've come up with. I'm much more interested in knowing that you've been able to take these concepts and understand the meaning behind them. Okay, so as you're studying, imagine that you're teaching someone else, or maybe you want to try to teach someone else. Explain it to someone else. Explain it to your spouse, or to your kid sister, or to your dog, or to your coffee cup, right? Write things down. Again, writing, there's something about like the neural pathways between your hand and your brain. So when you actually are writing things down, it helps things stick in your brain way more than if you're just reading them over and over again, or if you're typing them even on a computer. There's something about that process. So write out answers to questions. Like, yeah, put it in your own words. And if there's anything you're like, I think I have a good answer for this, but I don't know if this makes sense, send me an email. Professor, does it make sense when I explain this concept in this way? I'm here. I'm happy to answer questions. Whatever you need. So yeah, what was I talking about before I went off on that tangent? For my midterm exam folks, my Wednesday folks, you've got material from the whole semester. So that means, like, back to the beginning, what is anthropology? And you've had quizzes along the way, so you know like what my multiple choice questions usually look like. What is anthropology? What are the different subfields of anthropology? What is culture? Let's see, what else? Those two methods lectures. So like, how do we do cultural anthropology research? Things like participant observation, longitudinal research, team research. What am I trying to say? Primary informants. And then archaeology methods, like survey, excavation, absolute dating, relative dating, superposition, all of that stuff. That's all fair game on the exam as well. Okay, I see another question's come in. This is, again, from the genetics lecture. Why am I blanking now on this? Evolutionary processes. There we go. I think this is the most that I've talked in the past, like, couple of days. So the evolutionary processes and genetics lecture, there's a question about epigenetics. This came from the very end of the lecture. I'll tell you right now, there's not a question on the exam about epigenetics, simply because there's not. Because I don't know enough about epigenetics to appropriately question you about it. But epigenetics is a really cool field, and I certainly, if you're interested in this whole process of like how humans develop the traits that we have, and like how are humans going to change moving forward, epigenetics is a really interesting field, because essentially what we're learning is that sometimes we pass on to our children genetic characteristics that aren't necessarily the genetic characteristics that we're using. So the way we tend to think about genes, or the way that we've thought about genes in the past, was like, you get the genes you get, and that's what you have to work with. And then you pass on to your kids exactly what you were working with. And yeah, maybe there's some mutations along the way, but it's like, whatever genes my body's using, that's the pool of genes that I could possibly pass on to my kid. It turns out, though, that, yeah, we have our genetic code, but we have lots of copies of our genetic code. So in case this piece of the genetic code that my body is using to program what I look like and how my body works, in case that one gets damaged, that's all right. Just shift to this next copy. It's the same thing, except there's mutational differences. There's slight differences between those different copies of our genomes. And sometimes we pass on to our kids the copies that we have sort of waiting in the background, like waiting on reserve. And so sometimes the copies that we pass down are copies that, for whatever reason, our bodies have decided we would be more advantageous to our children. So you see this in something like lactose intolerance or lactose tolerance, right? We know that some people can digest lactose from the milk of other animals and some people can't. And it looks like the way that lactose tolerance, the ability to digest those enzymes, developed was essentially people who were raising these, sheep and goats and maybe some cattle along the way. As they're drinking milk and incorporating dairy into their diets thousands of years ago, they had started out being lactose intolerant. But it looks like they were able to pass on genes to their children that were slightly more lactose tolerant. So they're passing on characteristics that they're not technically using. So epigenetics is like this new level of stuff that we're just understanding in how our bodies pass on genes. And it's also something that you see, for example, with PTSD. And this is where I think it gets really profound. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is not genetic. It's like you have to be exposed to trauma, and then that affects the way your brain sort of interacts with the world, right? PTSD causes a lot of people to be basically on high alert constantly, like hypervigilance, because it's like their trauma could happen again, this danger could happen again, and so I always have to be ready. I have to be aware of the fact that danger might come so I can protect myself. You're not supposed to be able to pass that on to a child because it's something that happens, that trauma happens within your own lifetime. But what it's now looking like is that we actually can pass on to children a genetic predisposition toward having kind of a pre-traumatized brain, so that kids are being born responding to trauma that they never actually experienced themselves. And this is why I'm not asking about this on the exam, because it's something that I don't fully get. And it's beyond what we need right now in terms of what we're talking about in class, but it's a really cool field. And I think it's going to be really important for how we understand, not only like how we all interact with each other, but how trauma can actually be passed generationally, and how, we can't just dismiss things that happened 100 years ago or 200 or 300 or 400 years ago and say, oh, well, that bad thing that happened, that was so long ago, it doesn't affect people today. Well, if that trauma keeps getting repeated genetically through the generations, then it's very relevant to the world we live in today. Okay, I see another question has come in. How to remember the physical characteristics of Homo erectus, Neanderthal. There's not too many physical characteristics that I like, specific physical characteristics that I need you to remember for this exam. We're trying to make this a little bit more general. So for everyone, whether you're in my hybrid class or my Wednesday class, I mentioned this before, but I will repeat. I do not expect you to remember every single species of hominin that's discussed in those two hominin evolution lectures, right? It would be cruel and unkind for me to ask you, like, what the brain size of Australopithecus afarensis was, and how tall was it, and exactly when did it live, from 3.8 to 4.2 in exactly this location? No, because this is a general intro to anthropology class, and this is not a specifically hominin evolution class. What I want you to remember are the broader characteristics, the broader trends that we see within those three major groups of hominins. So for example, the Australopithecus species, there's a whole bunch of them, but I just want you to remember them as a group. Where did they live? Well, they lived in Africa, right? Even though the name Australopithecus sounds like Australia, they did not live in Australia. Don't tell me they lived in Australia. It's just because Australo, which is at the beginning of both of those words, it means southern, right? Australia is the southernmost continent, so it got that name like Southland. And Australopithecus means the southern ape, because the first Australopithecus fossils were found in South Africa. So Australopithecus, it lived in Africa, roughly between 2 to 4 million years ago. What about their brain size? Did they have big brains or small brains? Small brains. Their teeth, did they have big teeth or small teeth? They had big teeth. Okay, what do their big teeth tell us? Their big teeth tell us that they ate tougher foods, and that they had, they were eating a typically lower quality diet, meaning they're probably not eating a lot of meat or a lot of animal protein. So they're eating things like leaves, maybe some grasses, fruit, and they have to, because that food is lower in quality than, say, meat, they have to eat more of it throughout the day to get enough calories and nutrients to power their bodies. The more food you have to eat throughout the day, or the tougher the food is, the more your teeth and your jaw have to be able to withstand the stresses of chewing up that food. Okay? So Australopithecus had big teeth, small brains, and relatively low quality food. Paranthropus, which includes Robustus, Ethiopicus, boisei, Paranthropus takes that trend of Australopithecus to an extreme, right? They've got small brains, but if we look at their teeth, they're not only big, they're very big. Really, really big molars. They've also got these really big flared cheekbones, and then they have that little mohawk of bone called the sagittal crest. That little sagittal crest exists as an attachment point for really massive chewing muscles. So if you look at the skull of a gorilla, it also has a sagittal crest. And that's because gorillas eat low quality foods. They eat leaves all day long. Think about how many leaves would a 500-pound male gorilla have to eat to power its body through the day? It's got to be eating like all day long to get enough calories. If you're eating all day long, it puts a lot of stress on your face. And so you need chewing apparatus that is going to be able to withstand that stress. So really big teeth, thick enamel, big chewing muscles. And then that tells us also about the quality of their food. Paranthropus, with their small brain and their really big chewing muscles and big teeth and big jaws, had very low quality food, right? And again, low quality food puts a little bit of constraint on how big the brain can become. Our brains require a lot of calories. Pound for pound, it's the most expensive tissue in our bodies. So the bigger the brain, the more calories are needed to power it. With all of that low quality food that we see in the Australopithecus and the Paranthropus, it was, I don't want to say impossible, but they were really constrained by their low quality diet in how big their brains could get. Now with the later Australopithecus, they're starting to incorporate some more animal proteins. They're not hunters, they're scavenging. They're waiting until other animals are killing things like, wildebeest or antelope or whatever it is. Wait till a lion kills something. When the lion's done eating, all right, that's when we scoot in with our little stone tools and we get little scraps of meat, maybe that are left on the ends of bones. Or we can crack open the skull of a dead animal and get to the brain inside, or crack open the bone and get to the marrow. All of that's really nutrient rich. It's full of protein. You can go a lot further on a little bit of protein than you can on a little bit of leaves, or even a lot of leaves. So as they start incorporating more animal protein, that also allows brains to become bigger. And so this is where we see then the Homo species diverging from that original big teeth, small brain trend, with the Homo species like Homo ergaster, Homo erectus, Homo sapiens, Homo neanderthalensis. As they're incorporating more and more animal protein, brains are getting bigger because the quality of the diet is higher, and then teeth are getting smaller. So compared to our hominin ancestors, our teeth are really small, and our faces are really small. It's kind of hard to see in the pictures that are posted in the lectures. But like the Australopithecus and the Paranthropus and the Kenyanthropus especially, those early groups of hominins had really snouty faces. This is called prognathism. They're these really like pronounced forward projecting snouts. And our faces have become really flattened. Our face has altogether become smaller. And that's because the quality of our food has gone up so much. It's not hard for us to get calories today. And our teeth are still catching up to that. Our teeth have actually adapted slower than our faces, which is why some of us, we don't have room in our mouths for all of our teeth, right? That's why we have to get our wisdom teeth out, because our teeth are too big for our quickly evolving faces. So again, it's not as important to remember the specific characteristics of Homo erectus or Neanderthalensis or even Homo sapiens. Think about the bigger trends within the genus groups of Australopithecus, Paranthropus, and Homo. I've got like 17 cups in front of me. There we go. All right, I see we still have got about 20 more minutes that I'm, guaranteed to be here. We've still got a number of people online. So what other questions can I answer for you? Especially if you're in my Wednesday class, your midterm exam is a bit longer than my hybrid students because you're looking at both Unit 1 and Unit 2. So if you don't, seriously, don't forget about Unit 1. Half of the exam is Unit 1 and half of the exam is Unit 2. So don't let that part slide. Let me just see. Okay. Any tricks to draw skull diagrams? I have no tricks to draw skull diagrams. I assume you mean like to draw the certain characteristics of skulls? No. And certainly if you are a student in my class and you're thinking about the exam, you're not going to have to draw anything. There, a couple little like, look at this map or fill in this diagram. But yeah, I'm not sure I know exactly what types of skull diagrams you're referring to. If I was going to draw a skull, it would kind of go like this. It would depend on what species I'm talking about. But this is my version of an Australopithecus. There's a little Australopithecus brain. Here's his big orbits for his eyes. And then there's the nice big snouty mouth, right? You've got your little foramen magnum right there. Got your big teeth. If it's a Paranthropus, then it goes there. That's my skull. All right, let's see. I was just pulling up the midterm study guide. Yeah, so what is cultural relativism, ethnocentrism? Why is race not a biological reality? That might be something that you want to look into if you're in my Wednesday class. Yeah, and I'm sorry about drawing the skull diagram. If I'm just not understanding what you're referring to, then please clarify and let me know. But this exam is going to be relatively drawing free, because Blackboard really limits us in our capabilities. Let's see. What is culture? What is enculturation? Oh yeah, so do chimpanzees have culture? That might be something that you want to think about. If you were a cultural anthropologist, how would you do your field work? So like things like participant observation, which I mentioned before. Like I would want you to know not only what some methods of doing cultural anthropology field work is, but like what those mean. So you would say, okay, as a cultural anthropologist, I would use participant observation. Cool, and now tell me what it is. Participant observation means doing all the same activities as the host group, and maybe this would allow me to get a deeper understanding of the culture. I would do team research where multiple anthropologists are all working in the same study area, and we would have problem-oriented research so that we could each focus on a very specific issue within the community. Like, tell me what the methods are, and then explain a little bit what they mean. Physical anthropology, if you were going to do archaeology fieldwork, what are the two main phases of doing fieldwork? So you'd say, well, first I'd start out with survey, where I walk around the landscape and I take notes and pictures using maps and GPS to document where there are like concentrations of fossils or artifacts or where there's not. And then based on my findings, I would set up an excavation where I dig in controlled grids. I would make notes about soil changes, and I would collect artifacts and fossils, and I would use a total station to map them in, whatever. Tell me about absolute and relative dating and examples of absolute and relative dating, right? Absolute dating is when you can put an exact number on something. So you would say this bone, wherever my bones went, this bone is 5,000 years old, or this stone tool was made 10,000 years ago. If there's a number, it's absolute dating. And then relative dating is when you can say older or younger. So this rock is older than that bone. This bull is younger than that religious shrine or whatever it is. So older than or younger than is relative dating. An example of relative dating or a technique of relative dating would be seriation, which a lot of you did that extra credit on seriation, right? Where you put the sites in chronological order. In no part of that extra credit did you tell me exactly how old those sites were, because it was all just about this one's older than that, this one's younger than that. And then techniques of relative dating would be things like C14 dating or radiocarbon dating, or dendrochronology, which is tree ring dating. So, think about how these concepts sort of fit together to create like stories about each of these subjects. All right, I see people tapering off, which is just fine. But for those of you who are still here, what else can I talk to you about? Are you feeling all right? I mean, I know this is how everyone wants to spend their Friday evening, right? I'm happy to be here. Let's final words on the exam. For everyone, if you run into a problem with Blackboard, let me know. Yeah, I mean, someone's going to have the problem where like their computer dies or the internet craps out for a second. If that happens, the connection to Blackboard, if it gets shut down, the test will automatically close and you won't be able to open it up again. But don't freak out. Just shoot me an email and I will take a look at your exam and I'll open it back up for you. Okay. It will happen to someone. It might happen to you. It is no cause for stress. Just let me know what's going on and I'll take care of it. And as I'm sure you all know, it's WrestleMania this weekend. So I'm going to be, like sitting down, and I'm going to have my phone right with me. I'll be able to see your emails coming in because I am not moving from my couch for all of this weekend. The test is timed. Yes, it is. So for my hybrid classes, there is a 90-minute timer on the exam, but you can go beyond the 90 minutes if you need to. I gave it a 90-minute timer because that's how long I think it should take approximately. So if you go a little bit beyond it, it's fine. If I see that the exam's open for like 3 hours, that's when things start to be like, that's a bit more than what we're looking for here. So, that's what I think it should take. For my Wednesday class, it's a 2-hour timer because it is a longer exam. Okay, so I just saw a question come in. You know what? This is an important question, Memo, so I'm not ignoring you. One more thing that I wanted to say, it's kind of mentioned on, I put up a big sort of like image right before the exam in the Unit 2 course content folder. So you kind of like have to see that before you open the exam. But I just want to reiterate, in case you're not reading the directions carefully, that for all of my classes, both my hybrid classes and my Wednesday class, on the short answer section of the exam, there are a lot of options of questions, okay? So I think for my hybrid classes, there's like 5 short answer questions, and for my Wednesday class, there's 6 short answer questions. But for both of you, you only have to answer 3, okay? You only have to answer 3 of the short answer questions in that section. And I tried to be very, very clear. Like, these questions, pick 3 of those. And then at the very bottom, there's an extra credit question that doesn't count as one of those 3. Pick the best 3 that you want to answer, and I will give you the points for those best 3. If you want to answer more, or if you do end up answering more than those 3 best ones out of the 5 or the 6, I will give you the points for the best 3. You won't get extra credit, but you'll earn points for the best ones, okay? So just read the instructions. Just read the instructions. Okay. Okay, so let me answer this question. I'm planning on studying everything and doing everything before tomorrow. How many hours for studying do you suggest for the exam, and how long should we expect to get our results back? I don't know that I can tell you exactly how many hours you need to study for the exam. It really depends on, it's kind of down to every individual. Some people I know, and I'm just throwing this out into the universe. Some people I know have been really good about keeping up with the material. They're showing up to class every week, while we were still in class. They're taking great notes. They're reviewing on their own each week. Those are people who are just like, all right, I'm just going to keep up with it, keep up with it, keep up with it. Those people probably have to invest a little bit less time studying just because they've been putting in the work up front. That's not to say, though, that you can't be successful if you haven't been doing that all along. I would recommend here's what I would say not to do. Don't wait until Sunday afternoon and then sit down with all of your notes and try to jam it all in your head and then take the exam immediately afterwards. This is Friday evening, but you've still got a long time. You've still got like 48 hours before you need to work on the exam. Don't spend all 48 of them studying, but study in chunks, Go through a chunk of material, give your brain a little rest, go through another chunk of material, and then go back and quickly review what you already covered before. Take a little rest. Move on to the next bit and do a little bit of review of what came before. Things really get stuck in your brain when you repeat them over and over again. But if you overwhelm your brain with all the information all at once, it gets muddled, it gets mixed up, and it gets really hard to remember. So you also have to take care of your brain. And now more than ever, right? Our brains are in these very unnatural settings. We're not interacting the way that we're supposed to. We are social creatures. Our brains are meant to interact with people, and not just through screens. We're meant to interact face to face, and we're meant to touch each other. And that's exactly what we're not allowed to do right now. So our brains are already struggling with this new way that we have to live for the time being. So what you can do to sort of compensate for that is at least give your brain all of the other advantages possible. Get enough sleep. Don't stay up all night studying for this exam. It's not worth breaking your brain for one anthropology exam. Give your brain good food. Give it the high quality diet that our ancestors worked so hard for us to be able to get. And then go in chunks. Go, do the repetition, and also just cut yourself some slack at a certain point, right? This is one day in your life. It's not the end of the world. But the more comfortable you get with the material, the easier it's going to be. So I can't tell you how much you can study or how much you should study, but hopefully you walk into the exam feeling comfortable. Because when you're comfortable, you're confident, right? And that's what you want on an exam. Okay, and how long should you expect to get results back? I don't know, honestly. The exam is due Sunday night. I already know that because of illness and work, some folks aren't going to be able to get the exam in on Sunday. It's going to take a little bit because there are something like, 80 students potentially taking the exam. So that's a lot of exams for me to grade. It might not be until later in the week. But hopefully it won't be too much later than Thursday. I mean, if I really manage to get myself in gear, like Tuesday, but I just don't know that it's going to be possible. And it also kind of depends on how much, like how quickly people do get those exams in. But I'll try to keep you informed. All right. I'll really try to keep you updated on what's going on there. Okay. I see another question. Difference between techniques, method, and methodology with examples. It's part of fieldwork traditions. So in thinking about, methodology and techniques and fieldwork, I would say, remember as you're studying that we've talked about two different approaches to doing fieldwork in two different subfields of anthropology. So we talked about cultural anthropology fieldwork, and we talked about archaeology/physical anthropology fieldwork. They have two completely different methods and methodologies for doing fieldwork because they're asking different questions, right? Cultural anthropologists are studying human cultures that are alive today, people that you can go talk to today. Archaeology and physical anthropology, in terms of studying human evolution, that's studying the past. And so if we're studying the past, we can't walk up to someone and say, hey, tell me how you evolved. Tell me what your ancestors' bones look like. We can't do it through that type of interaction. So the ways that anthropologists get their data is going to be extremely different between the different subfields of anthropology. And what I want you to know is, how do we do fieldwork as cultural anthropologists, and how do we do fieldwork as archaeologists? For my Wednesday students, right? For my Wednesday students, if you're in my hybrid class, you covered this all in your Unit 1 exam, so you don't have to worry about that. But if you're in my Wednesday class, what is a cultural anthropologist and how do they do their research? What is an archaeologist and how do they do their research? I hope that answers your question. We are almost at done o'clock. But I can certainly take one more if it comes in. Well, all right then, my friends. Or I should say, all you cats and kittens. I think we'll leave it at there then. And yeah, if anyone has any questions though between now and when you take the exam, if you want any clarity on anything, please get in touch with me. I would say email me if we need to, though. We can always jump on to Collaborate Ultra if you want to do like a face-to-face. I was going to say, I should be around for the next couple of days. Of course I'm going to be around the next couple of days. Where am I going? We're in quarantine. So anyway, I hope you're all doing well. I'm constantly thinking about all of you and hoping that you're all right and you're staying safe and thinking about your families. And I know a lot of you are also essential workers. So thank you for the work that you're doing every day. You're keeping the city going. And I know that trying to do this on top of all of that is a lot. So if there's some way that I can support you, just let me know, because it's my job to help you through all of this stuff. Okay? All right. Well, take care, everyone. Have a good evening. And yeah, anything comes up with the exam, let me know, and you'll still be hearing from me. I'll send you a lot of annoying emails over the next couple days. Okay? All right. Good evening, everyone. Have a good one and be well. Bye.